Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Stephen Conway. Stephen is Emeritus Professor of History at University College London. He has published extensively on the American Revolution and the British Army in the 18th century. Today, Stephen will discuss the outcomes of the American War of Independence from the perspective of the British Army. This talk is part of our American Revolution series, where we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the start of the American War of Independence. Time for tech questions. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audience. For the audience online, if you want to post the question in the Q&A chat bar, we will put those to the speaker at the end. In person, just raise your hand at the end and I'll come round with this lovely microphone. Moving on to some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest you click the refresh button, usually cures all ills. A member of the team will be active in the chat bar to assist you if you have any issues or queries. With that all being said, I'm now going to hand over to Stephen to start the talk. Hope you enjoy.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and also thank you very much everyone for being here, either in person or online. I should say straight away that the word successes here needs to be understood in a relative rather than an absolute sense. On any objective reckoning of the strength of the two sides fighting in North America in the first years of the War of Independence, the British should have put down the colonial rebellion. In terms of population, military, naval, and financial strength, the British very clearly had enormous advantages. Yet, as we'll see, the war was not as much of a David versus Goliath struggle as some American historians suggest. British victory would in truth have been against the odds. Traditional explanations for British failure tend to highlight the revolutionary fervour of the Americans, their superior tactical skills, the leadership of Washington, and the incompetence and unsuitability of the British Army. Not only is each of these explanations in itself not very satisfactory, even taken together, they don't really begin to account for why the Americans were able to hold off the British and sustain their independence. Now, American enthusiasm was palpable at the beginning of the war. Militiamen besieging General Thomas Gage's British garrison in Boston in 1775 were truly motivated by a desire to defend their communities from the British Army. And at this stage, there was a genuine rage militaire, as people described it at the time, a military enthusiasm that seems to have gripped the colonists who were drilling and preparing to fight, not just in New England, where the war started, but further south. But I think we should, first of all, not make the mistake of assuming that enthusiasm is a guarantee of success. The Declaration of Independence, when read to the American Continental troops at New York in July 1776, inspired loud cheering and great whoops of joy. But the American performance in the subsequent fighting on Long Island, right next to New York, hardly suggests that fervour was an adequate substitute for professionalism. The American forces were resoundingly defeated by the British Army. And I think we should also note that by the closing stages of the conflict in America, war weariness was much more conspicuous than war enthusiasm. In Virginia, which is one of the cradles of the Revolution, British forces met with remarkably little local resistance in 1779, 1780, and even in the final year of the war in North America, 1781. Nor, I think, should we exaggerate the significance of the Americans' use of what would later be termed guerrilla warfare, individuals shooting at the British from behind cover. This is part of the mythology of the American Revolution. The Americans used these guerrilla tactics against the serried ranks of British redcoats who were mowed down as a consequence. Militiamen did take pot shots at British troops at various moments in the war, most familiarly, perhaps, in the first armed clash at Lexington and Concord, and particularly on the retreat from Concord. The British were harassed by an unseen enemy and suffered significant casualties. But there were also similar occasions later in the war, in the winter of 1776-77 in New Jersey and in South Carolina in 1780, where the British faced militia resistance and what we would now describe as guerrilla warfare. Now, the testimony of British officers themselves suggests that this irregular fighting did cause the British Army some distress, dented its morale. But I think we should certainly not assume that it constituted the main part of the rebels' military effort. And it certainly did not win the war in America. George Washington appreciated that what in the 18th century was called partisan warfare, rather than guerrilla warfare, partisan tactics had a part to play. But he was very keen not to fight a decentered war where authority and decision-making was taken at a grassroots level. He was temperamentally and socially a very conservative man. He was part of the Virginia squirearchy. He had no wish to see a social revolution alongside a political revolution. And he placed his faith in creating a continental army which would be much like the British army it was opposing. He wanted a professional military force that could take on a professional military force. And he was very disdainful of the militia troops he took command of in New England in 1775. He regarded them as pretty hopeless, and he worked very hard to create a continental army in the image of the British army that at one stage earlier in his life he'd wished to join and become an officer in. And as the war progressed, he did make some progress in converting the militia assembly that he inherited into some form of semi-professional force. And many of its soldiers, as the war went on, started to be much like the soldiers in a European army, predominantly from the bottom of the social pile. Men of no means, or unemployed, or poor, and driven into the service of the military by their poverty, not by their enthusiasm. And in that sense, it was actually quite an advantage for the American forces, because poverty encouraged the same men to re-enlist year after year, which meant that the American rank and file became increasingly experienced and less of an annual levy. Now, to deny Washington a role in the survival of the United States would, I think, be churlish in the extreme. His bold counterattack at Trenton in New Jersey in December 1776, when all seemed lost for the Americans, may have saved the revolution from collapse. He was admired, even revered, far beyond the boundaries of the new United States. He gave the revolution a respectable face to many Europeans, including many Britons. Even General William Howe, who succeeded Gage as British Commander-in-Chief, while not recognizing Washington as an equal, addressed him as though he were almost a fellow professional. But the quality of Washington's generalship can easily be overstated. He was no Napoleon, no Frederick the Great. He was comprehensively defeated by Howe in the New York campaign of 1776, losing heavily on Long Island, and was beaten again at Brandywine Creek in Pennsylvania the following year. Most of the battles he fought, he lost or failed to win. In 1778, some congressional delegates even seriously considered replacing him with Horatio Gates, who had been a former British Army officer. Washington's real achievement, I would contend, was to keep his troops in the contest. He embodied American determination to carry on despite setbacks and defeats. His army became the symbol of American resistance, or what his colleague, the Rhode Islander Nathaniel Greene, called the stamina of American liberty. So long as it survived to fight another day, the American cause survived with it. Washington therefore pursued a strategy of avoiding battle wherever possible, denying his opponents the opportunity to deliver the knockout blow that they needed to win the war. He had the good sense to see that the British, fighting far from home, were less well equipped to play the long game. Now, the British Army was far from the hopelessly unsuited military force that it sometimes suggested it was. Many historians imply that it was as much a reflection of the ills of an aristocratic order as the American armed forces were somehow the embodiment of a liberty-loving society from which they sprang. But if many of the British Army's senior officers were indeed aristocrats, they were by no means all foppish incompetents. A good number took their military duties very seriously and worked hard to acquire professional skills. William Howe, though the brother of a viscount, won his appointment to American command at least partly because he had served in America in the 7 Years' War, the preceding war, and he had experience of light infantry tactics. General Cornwallis, who was an earl, was a daring commander who pushed himself and his men to the limit. Sir Henry Clinton, who succeeded Howe as commander-in-chief, was the grandson of an earl. But though much criticised for his seeming inactivity, he showed occasional flashes of real boldness and a keen strategic appreciation of the realities of the war in America. These were not incompetent generals by any means. The soldiers they led, while punished severely at times, were not simply terrorized into doing their duty by violence or its threat. They appear, from the little testimony we have from the common soldier in this period, often to have been actually motivated by a sense of loyalty to the king and their country. And it's clear that British officers, when trying to inspire their men, didn't rely simply on the lash and the noose. They relied on explaining to them what the purpose of the war was, appealing to their instincts as professional soldiers. And the British Army, despite its reputation, adapted remarkably quickly to American conditions, just as it had done in the previous war, the 7 Years' War. Not only were its uniforms modified, but its tactics changed too. Already, even at the beginning of the war, in the spring of 1775, its light infantry companies were used to firing and reloading while lying flat on the ground. This is a completely different image than one normally has of the 18th century British Army. During the early years of the war, the rest of the army acquired experience in similar methods. And in July 1781, this is a really interesting moment when the stereotypes are are completely demolished. In July 1781, during one of the last battles of the war in America at Green Spring, Virginia, British troops literally turned the tables on their American opponents. The Americans who had adopted European-style close order formations were shot at by an unseen British enemy in a complete reversal of what had happened at the start of the war. So the British Army adapted remarkably well to American conditions. So if the failure of the British to win the war in America isn't attributable to superior American morale or leadership or tactics, what is the explanation? In 1775, the revolt was general and had no readily identifiable geographical centre. The rebel colonies had no capital city in a European sense, as they'd come together only to resist British authority and had no tradition of unity. They were separate colonies with separate cultures, histories, and traditions. No American city could possibly act as a capital city. Philadelphia, though it was the home of the Continental Congress and the largest urban centre, could not be compared with a European capital, which meant that its capture by Howe's forces in 1777 had only very limited impact on American morale. The British occupation of other major towns, particularly New York City and Charleston in South Carolina, similarly failed to produce the psychological blow that could have been expected if a European city like Vienna or Berlin had been taken by an enemy. The rebel colonies were predominantly rural. The vast majority of the people were scattered across a large expanse of territory. Much of that territory was difficult for armies to access. Areas like the Delaware Valley, in the middle of the North American colonies, posed few challenges. They were flat and possessed an established road network and had long been under cultivation. Virginia was also very open to attack, thanks to extensive navigable waterways that allowed British raiders to move easily inland. Interior New England was altogether more difficult for military campaigning. Covered with wood and hilly, in the words of one British officer, it was far from easy to penetrate. Even more of a barrier was the forested wilderness of upper New York, through which General John Burgoyne's army attempted to proceed from Canada in the summer of 1777. Roads existed, but whenever the British and German troops departed from the established routes, they were obliged to cut down trees and construct new roads. Small wonder that Burgoyne's expedition made very, very slow progress. The very size of the North American theatre of operations was itself a problem for the British forces. It was much bigger than the Army's traditional areas of European deployment in the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, and even Western Germany. The British troops that fought in the Austrian Netherlands, that's roughly the equivalent of modern-day Belgium, in the 1740s, would have been thinking in terms of a theatre of operations stretching between the French and Dutch borders, and that's a distance of less than 80 miles. The British Army's campaigns in the 7 Years' War in northwest Germany were conducted over a larger area. From Bremen in the north to not far from Frankfurt in the south is about 200 miles. But in 1779, Sir Henry Clinton commanded troops as far apart as Penobscot in modern-day Maine and Savannah in Georgia. That is a distance, as the crow flies, of about 1,200 miles. Now, to coordinate the campaigns of British troops separated by large tracts of territory that remained in rebel hands was no easy matter, as the fate of Burgoyne's expedition from Canada in 1777, forced to surrender to a numerically much superior American force, emphatically demonstrated. If distances within North America posed difficulties for the British Army, the distance between the imperial centre, Britain itself, and the colonies presented even greater challenges. Communication across the Atlantic was often very slow. We're talking about the age of sail. It took a sailing ship approximately 5 to 7 weeks to reach Boston from England, and 4 to 5 weeks to make the return journey. In the days of modern technology and modern means of communication, where we can communicate with each other across the globe instantly, the thought of having to wait weeks, months, to be able to send one message and receive a reply, I think gives you a real sense of the challenge. To micromanage the war from London, as Lord George Germain, who was the Secretary of State for the colonies, who effectively ran the British war effort, as he really Germain appreciated, it would have been a hopeless undertaking to try and micromanage this war from such a distance. But even the setting of a general strategy was hampered by distance, as ministers were so far from the American campaigning grounds. And Germain's failure to coordinate the plans for 1777, when Howe effectively left Burgoyne to fend for himself, owed much to the problems of poor communication. Some of it perhaps down to Germain's reluctance to impose his will, but at least of much to the time it took for instructions to reach the commanders on the spot. Howe replied to Germain's request that he complete the Pennsylvania campaign in time to help Burgoyne in Upper New York. He replied far too late. He replied at the end of August, and it would have been many weeks later that Germain learned that Howe was actually not going to be in any position to help Burgoyne at all. It was far too late to do anything. So transatlantic distances presented other difficulties for the British. When they had campaigned in North America in the 7 Years' War, British troops had been able to draw on local sources of supply, food. They were fighting in effectively a home territory when they were fighting against the French in Canada. In the War of Independence, the British Army was reliant on food and other essentials shipped more than 3,000 miles from Britain and Ireland. And in 1776, General Howe was actually very pleased with the logistical support he had, but to sustain the army so far from home by supplies sent across the Atlantic was no easy undertaking. Every year it required a massive effort to assemble the ships and the provisions required. For brief periods, the army did control enough territory in North America to be able to reduce this dependence on a really extended Atlantic supply line. But no British commander-in-chief could be confident of local sources. The Atlantic crossing was always hazardous. American privateers would attack isolated British supply vessels. And once the French entered the war, and I'll be talking about French intervention more in a minute, once the French entered the war, the army's umbilical cord was frequently endangered. And of course, the British Army in North America was also a long way away from its chief source of reinforcements. Again, the contrast with the 7 Years' War is very marked. In the 7 Years' War, about half the forces deployed against the French in Canada were raised locally in the North American colonies. Half were regular troops, half were what were called American provincial troops. So it was an Anglo-American effort. Now, in the War of Independence, most Americans were fighting against the British. There were some who remained loyal to the British, and about a third of the British forces fighting in North America were actually American. But that difference between a third and a half is very significant, and of course it meant that every casualty the British suffered had to be replaced by bringing somebody 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. And that is a major problem for the British, because it almost certainly inhibited British generals from pursuing the knockout blow if they thought they may experience really heavy casualties in securing victory. So it inhibited them, it held them back from doing what perhaps would have been necessary to win the war decisively. That's particularly so, I think, of General William Howe, who may have been inhibited by political considerations. He didn't want to alienate the Americans by too bloody a suppression of the rebellion. He was trying to think beyond the war and how was he going to reconcile Americans to return to British rule. But he was almost certainly influenced as well by the thought that if he suffered really heavy casualties, he wasn't going to be able to carry on fighting for much longer. Now, the British Army didn't expand dramatically in the first years of the war. The King, rather than agree to the raising of new regiments that would have facilitated the rapid growth of the army's size, preferred to hire German auxiliaries who would be ready for immediate service in the 1776 campaign, which was the campaign the British hoped would win the war. Even when Washington's counterattack at Trenton at the end of that year made a further British campaign inevitable, the government decided to hire yet more German troops rather than create new British regiments. Reliance on the Germans made great sense in military terms. The Hessians, who were most of the German auxiliary troops, came from Hesse-Kassel and Hesse-Hanau. The Hessians, as they were called, at least the first contingent sent to America in 1776, were experienced professionals who acquitted themselves very well in their first battles. American hopes that these German troops as mercenaries lacked commitment to the British cause and could be persuaded to desert proved over-optimistic. Not a single Hessian soldier deserted for many months after their arrival in North America. German desertion only really became a serious problem when the war was effectively over. But politically, the hiring of the Germans was perhaps a mistake. In late 1775, before American independence, and when there were still some possibilities of a patching up of the difference between Britain and the American colonies, the involvement of the German troops was cited by some Americans as a reason for actually persisting with their rebellion. They regarded the King as having thrown his colonial subjects out of the British family by employing foreigners to put down fellow Britons in North America. So it may psychologically have been a big mistake, I think, to employ German auxiliary troops. This was a war, as Clinton later put it, to gain the hearts and subdue the minds of America, and hiring German troops may not have helped the British to win that war. Perhaps even more damagingly, the British Army became associated with parts of the American population that the settler community feared or hated. Native warriors allied themselves to the British and raided the frontier. They saw the British as infinitely preferable to the colonial Americans because the British were trying to control westward expansion, slow it down, and preserve native hunting lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Americans wanted to get that land. They wanted to expand vigorously. So from a Native American point of view, it made great sense to support the British. But whether that was such a good thing for the British is open to question. On the positive side of the equation, Native Americans ravaged the frontier, causing enormous economic damage and dislocation, and eventually forced Washington to redeploy some of his Continental Army to the frontier to attack Native Americans and reduce their attacks on frontier communities. But the British were not necessarily advantaged. Many members of the settler population especially those near the exposed frontier, felt a deep hostility to the natives based on generations of conflict and the passing down of horrific atrocity stories. Some British officers imagined that American fear of the Indians could be turned to good account. Native incursions would terrorize the rebels into submission. And at least a few Americans were no doubt terrorized, but others seem to have been inspired to more determined resistance. And it's surely no coincidence that the very large numbers of New Englanders who flocked to join the American forces opposing Burgoyne's army as it advanced from Canada, they were attracted to attack Burgoyne because his army included an important native component. Now, equally damaging, so far as the British attempts to win over the settler population were concerned, was the Royal Forces association with the enslaved population of the colonies. Settlers on the frontier lived in a constant anxiety about Indian attack. Whites throughout the colonies worried about the flight or even mutiny of slaves. Desperate British officers, cooped up in Boston at the start of the war, contemplated mobilizing the enslaved to overawe the rebels, particularly in the southern colonies, where the enslaved population was concentrated. In Britain itself, a few politicians even suggested that this might be a good way of overcoming the army's numerical weakness in America. The British government, so far as we can tell, never seriously considered such an option. The reliance of the British Caribbean colonies on slave labour would have made any encouragement to large-scale slave rebellion a very risky strategy. But Lord Dunmore, who was the last royal governor of Virginia, did attempt to rally the enslaved to his standard in 1775. 4 years later, in 1779, effectively repeated Dunmore's offer of freedom to any enslaved person who left his rebel master and came into the British lines. Clinton's intention, it seems, was not to arm the enslaved and use them as military auxiliaries, but to encourage them to leave their owners and undermine the revolutionary economy. But the association of the army with the flight and freedom of slaves reduced the chances of winning over wavering whites. Far from being cowed by the threat of a great slave insurrection, or even by the seemingly unstoppable hemorrhaging of their black labour force, white slave owners seem to have become more determined to resist British authority. Even loyally inclined Americans complained bitterly at the loss of their slaves. The Loyalists themselves, or at least the Loyalists in arms, might be counted as another group that made the British task of securing American hearts and minds more difficult. Lord George Germain envisaged the Loyalists as a vital element in the British war effort. He continued to believe right until the end that most Americans supported a restoration of royal rule, and that all that was required was a British force to inspire them to rise up against the tyranny of Congress. Senior British officers, while becoming more sceptical about the number of loyalists as the war proceeded, recognised that arming what they called the good subjects against the bad might help to subdue the rebellion and to some extent make up for the limited number of regular troops available. But setting Americans against Americans made the war even more of a fratricidal contest and added greatly to the animosities engendered on both sides. Loyalist military units might contain a sprinkling of British officers and sergeants and include in their rank and file some former rebels, but they were mainly made up of people who'd lost property and maybe even family members to their opponents. And they were not the kind of people who were going to treat the American rebels with any kind of generosity of spirit. The desire of such loyalists for revenge made it difficult for British commanders to prevent them from ruining the chances of reconciliation. One particularly notorious unit was called the Associated Loyalists, and they soon acquired a reputation for depredation and cruelty, leading one rebel to condemn Clinton as nothing but the ringleader of a banditti of robbers. At times, the British Army was actually little better. Though some Americans benefit from the economic opportunities offered by the presence of British troops, others had good cause to rue the day they encountered the Redcoats. British ministers and generals might see their forces as liberating Americans from the tyranny of Congress, but the troops arrived in the minds of most of the settler population, not as friends, but as invaders. As a result of the concentration of British forces in Boston in the months before the outbreak of the war, the rebels easily established their authority throughout the 13 colonies. In the summer of 1776, the British were therefore obliged to reclaim lost territory, not defend posts they'd already held. The first contact of British troops with American civilians was often when the troops arrived in a locality having beaten or in pursuit of Washington's Continentals. Flushed with triumph, British soldiers tended at that moment to treat inhabitants as fair game. In New Jersey, during November and December 1776, numerous local people had their property taken and their persons attacked. Many different sources report a large number of rapes. The experience was repeated in other areas into which the British advanced, even if the inhabitants of places under more settled British occupation were usually treated much less harshly. Though by no means all of the Americans who were affected took to arms against their oppressors, some accepted their fate, with remarkable fatalism. British depredations created enemies when the British Army needed more friends. But if the British Army could have done more to avoid large numbers of Americans gravitating towards the revolutionaries, its fundamental problem, the problem that made the war in America all but unwinnable for the British government, was the entry into the conflict of France, then Spain, and finally the Dutch Republic. Even before formal French intervention in the summer of 1778, foreign aid had sustained American resistance. Money and munitions were the most important contributions. In 1777, the first large French loan and a substantial delivery of French muskets sustained the American war effort. Even European manpower in the form of small numbers of trained officers who arrived as volunteers helped the Americans to hold off the British forces. Foreign money and munitions continued to flood in after 1778, and foreign money may have actually saved the American economy from total collapse in 1781. But once the French government committed itself to joining the war as a fully fledged belligerent, the nature of the conflict changed dramatically, and the American debt to Britain's European enemies increased massively. The British position would not have been so difficult if the British government had been able to secure European allies. Britain had never before in the 18th century fought France without the help of another major European power. The key to British success in the 7 Years' War had been using subsidies to pay German troops to tie down French resources on the continent, while British fleets and troops mopped up French overseas possessions. That was the formula that won Britain the 7 Years' War. Without any European allies to play the same role, the British could not deflect the French from devoting most of their efforts to a naval war. The French government poured money into building ships before and during the conflict. Its 53 ships of the line in 1778 had become 73 by 1783. For a brief moment in 1778, it seemed that the French government strategy might unravel. Austria and Prussia clashed over the Bavarian succession, and their local dispute threatened to bring on a much wider European war. But French ministers avoided being drawn into the conflict alongside their Austrian ally and kept their focus austerely on the struggle with Britain. Now, naval historians very reasonably argue that the French didn't actually have such a great advantage as it seemed. Effective navies could not be created overnight by transferring resources that would have funded an army into funding a fleet. It took years of steady investment to build up naval strength. But if France lacked the naval infrastructure that Britain possessed, in the short but vital period between 1775 and 1782, it was able to do enough to challenge the dominance of the Royal Navy and help to end British hopes in America. If the British government had secured a major continental ally, perhaps the French would have been compelled to devote more spending to their army, and their navy would have been much weaker. Britain's isolation was not, however, a chosen course. Many British politicians and diplomats, both before and during the War of Independence, sought to forge new links with one or more European powers to counterbalance France, only to find that none were interested. And the reason for that, I think, was British victory in the 7 Years' War. It convinced most European states that France no longer posed a real threat in Europe. The balance of power was not endangered by France's enormous power, because France's enormous power had been curbed. And Britain was now actually conceived as the threat to the balance of power, not France. The most obvious consequence of foreign intervention against Britain was the geographical expansion of the war to the Caribbean, Central America, West Africa, Europe and Asia. This became a truly global war from 1778. The British government now had to fight a multi-front conflict. Ministers in London agreed to continue the war in America, but with much more limited ambitions. They no longer thought it likely they'd be able to reclaim all of the rebel provinces. Their primary aim was to peel off the southern mainland colonies, which they thought would sustain the British West Indian Islands with vital supplies. So they carried on the war in America mainly for Caribbean purposes, to sustain the British West Indian Islands. And British military and naval resources were diverted away from America to other theatres of operation, particularly the Caribbean, but also home defence, because, of course, Britain itself was now exposed to invasion. France, just across the Channel, powerful, proximate, and the French posed a threat of invasion, a very real threat. In February 1778, on the eve of French intervention, 65% of the British military manpower was based in North America. By September 1780, it was down to 29%. So you can see what a kind of redeployment there was away from North America. And in these circumstances, with other arenas of conflict competing for troops and ships, the British forces in the rebel colonies were never strong enough to achieve even the government's much more now limited American aims. Within North America itself, foreign intervention made a real difference. The arrival of the French expeditionary force, led by the Comte de Rochambeau in 1780, made General Clinton, the British commander-in-chief, very fearful for his New York headquarters. His nightmare was that the French Navy would effectively, he was more concerned about the French Navy than the French Army. The French Navy would effectively cooperate with American and French troops to trap isolated British detachments. And Franco-American coordination was what he feared. Now, it was very difficult to pull off that kind of cooperation. There were tensions, in fact, between the French and the Americans. They weren't natural allies. They were in many ways complete political opposites. They were only united by their hostility to the British. But there were repeated attempts to pull off this cooperation and trap isolated British garrisons, but those failed to materialize in New York in 1778 and then in Newport, Rhode Island the same year. Failed again in Savannah in 1779, Savannah in Georgia. But in the autumn of 1781, the French and Americans finally pulled it off in spectacular fashion, compelling Cornwallis to surrender at Yorktown after the French Admiral de Grasse brought his ships into Chesapeake Bay, saw off a British fleet, and secured control of all the supply lines and effectively forced Cornwallis to surrender. So the British Army, though it failed to win the war, was not principally responsible for losing it. Given the challenges of fighting so far from home, I think you could argue it actually acquitted itself remarkably well. British defeat in North America owed much to logistical problems and French intervention. And it certainly didn't, I think, owe very much to any failings on the part of the British Army. Thank you.